If you're like me, you may have had this problem before. You're chatting with your buddies and wish to recommend a show to them, and when they ask you why you like it, for some reason, even though you unconsciously know why it appeals to you, you just can't put it into words, and your explanation either comes off like a rambling mess, or an underwhelming, I just think it's cool. For me, that show is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Written and illustrated by Hirohiko Araki since 1987, it follows the story of the Joestar family through multiple generations and a wide variety of locations. I'm guessing you probably already know about this goofy anime from the sheer amount of memes born from it and the influence it has on the field of animation and internet culture.
More ores than that one silly anime that nobody likes.
This is no time for a JoJo's reference! There's always time for a JoJo's reference!
And with something as big and as influential and monumental as JoJo's, trying to break down the appeal into a concise blurb always seemed impossible to me. And I don't think I'm alone in this feeling, as it's a pretty common sentiment among fans trying to get their friends to look past the silliness and slow opening arc, but we'll get to that. I think it's easy to get lost in all the small details that I enjoy, from sound design and dramatic set pieces, but what I want to try to do here is boil down the story to its core concepts and appeal. So let's go through what, at least in my opinion, draws so many people to this show, and how you can recommend it to your fellow weebs and animation nerds. And if you have not watched JoJo's, welcome! I'm going to spend God knows how long talking about an anime I quite like, and hopefully I can convince you of why so many people have fallen in love with the story of the Joestar family and their struggle. Join me as we go through my guide of how to get your friends into JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Now, before we really get into the thick of it, it's worth addressing something obvious, that being that you've probably heard of JoJo's through mimetic osmosis, or a few scant clips of the wild insanity that happens in it. For example, and yeah, those are really weird moments, and you wouldn't be wrong for assuming that a story of this level of insanity has any right to be taken seriously. Add to that the incessant amount of memes, which, I'm gonna be honest, a lot of them really aren't funny, even if you do get the joke. And references to these moments, and to the characters, and you get a pretty thick wall of obnoxious irreverence. Seriously, I completely get if that turns you away, but hear me out for just a second. The silly moments are part of the charm. I think it's very easy to see this anime as nothing more than a string of ridiculous set pieces, but I think there's a level of confidence here unlike any other piece of fiction. There's a temptation when writing to be safe, to avoid risk, for fear of alienating some potential part of your audience who might think your choice was unusual. If you make a part of your story unique or different, some people might not like it, and that's a scary thought for a creator. But JoJo's is a refusal of that mindset. And one of the things I find to be so beautiful about it is how you can see Araki growing more and more confident in his own brand of weirdness. The wide array of wild and shocking moments adds so much more character and excitement to the story. In everything from character design to narrative structure to combat scenarios, the story embraces the unusual, creating these incredible moments that embed themselves in your brain.
Wait, I see. So that's where his strength comes from. It's the elbow strikes to the ground. He's using the recoil to augment his punches. That speed, it's almost like a boxer trying to spring off the ropes to get some added snap.
This fosters a lingering anticipation and excitement to see what insane scenarios the heroes will have to deal with next. And I think what's also important to stress here is that the characters still treat the world seriously. They're not emotionless, they are just as surprised as the viewer, but they never drop the tension for the sake of a cheap meta joke. To them, even the insane powers of strange enemies or sheer sequences of events are still real, even within the thin line of logic binding the story together. And I think nothing sums this up better than this iconic, "Oh my God!" It's an insanely funny line. The English always catches me off guard and the delivery is fantastic, but it also acts as a cute nod to the audience that, yes, the characters do know it's crazy, but it's real to them. It encourages you to laugh along with this show, while still keeping your suspension of disbelief. These goofy moments are an iconic part of the series' identity, and one of the defining reasons why it has stayed so consistently popular. But I think what really gives them context and meaning beyond simple irreverence is the weight they hold to the wide cast of lovable characters. If your friend can get past the insanity of this series and embrace the show for all its weirdness, they will be hard-pressed to find a more magnetic lineup of protagonists. All parts follow a different member of the Joestar family, which makes each part feel distinct in its own way. Whether it's the noble conviction of Jonathan or the boyish charm of Josuke, each part's protagonist approaches their conflicts with their own fighting style and personality. This also means that if your friend doesn't like one part's Jojo, there might be another that fits their style. Let me show you what I mean with an example. Let's look at Joseph from Part 2 and Jotaro from Part 3. Jotaro is stoic and silent. He maintains this resolute attitude even when his opponents harass and taunt him, keeping his poise steady until the moment when he can close in and batter his opponent to a bloody pulp.
You let your stand's guard down to take a breath. Your stand may be invincible, but you sure as hell aren't. If I destroy you, then your stand dies too. Do you understand?
Joseph, on the other hand, is a brash and cocky trickster. He constantly talks to his opponents, makes jokes, and dances around the arena. He loves playing mind games by calling out his foe's next line, and often uses cleverly placed traps to gain the upper hand.
Child's play.
Sure, but I was still able to pull one over on you, wasn't I? And you should take a look at the grenade you just knocked away.
You son of a... Ah!
While Jotaro uses patience and observation to look for a weakness he can exploit, Joseph employs a barrage of sleight of hand and distractions to catch his opponents off guard. Just by looking in how these two protagonists solve problems, we can see how their fighting style reflects their personality. Each main character has their own appeal, and it shows in everything they do, in and out of fights. It's this form of characterization through action that makes each protagonist feel real. No JoJo is an island, however, and one of the greatest ways Araki further fleshes out his protagonists is by having them feature in other parts where they are not the central focus. Not only does this let us see a new side of a familiar face as they interact with the next generation, but it also shows the viewer how much they change with age. They feel so much more real as they grow older and wiser, taking on more of a mentor role while still maintaining their quirks and charm. Seeing a character you met when they were far younger interacting with their new relative reinforces the theme of bonds between generations. Despite any of the minor fights the Joestars get into with themselves, when the chips are down, family sticks together. Moments like this have a real tenderness to them, not just in seeing the two Joestars combine their powers in interesting ways. The interplay between the Joestars, especially as the threats they face grow stronger and stronger, show an incredible heartfelt bond. The Joestar family suffers a lot in the struggle against evil, but there's always an underlying sense that the next generation will continue the fight. Or perhaps your friend is a sucker for found family stories. Well, here's where the many, many hilarious and lovable side characters come in. The supporting cast of each part adds so much to the energy of the story and are so much more than comic relief or spectators. I think what makes JoJo's side characters so appealing is their connection to each other and the story of their part. Because they have their own goals and motivations outside of the protagonists, they feel much more real, and this sense of character shows brilliantly in the way they interact with each other. Araki also extends his unique brand of weirdness onto his side characters, giving them little quirks and traits that make them feel just a little bit more human and flawed.
Pick for me. It better be something amazing. Something gorgeous and sophisticated that suits a Frenchman such as moi.
Which means it doesn't matter. He'll eat anything.
But what I think is the most crucial factor to understanding the draw of JoJo's side characters is how they play into the greater narrative of each part. The world is often very cruel and cold to these characters, but that often acts as a catalyst to bond them with their Jojo's righteousness, in solidarity of the hardships that have fallen upon them.
Whatever his faults, your brother saved your life.
For the best example of how Araki uses his side characters to enrich his story, let's look at the gang of Part 5, Bruno Bucciarati's squad. From the moment our protagonist Giorno meets all these gang members, it's clear that these guys have a deep, caring respect for each other. They're a rowdy bunch of teenagers and misfits, capable of incredible violence when necessary, but they also crack jokes and get into dumb arguments. And despite their bickering, when Bruno speaks, they listen, not because he is their boss, but because they are deeply indebted to him for bringing them out of misery, and also introducing them to a group that made them feel safe, made them feel welcome, like family. As the story progresses and Giorno becomes more comfortable with the gang, we learn more about how each of them have been beaten down by circumstances of life. Whether it was police corruption, poverty, or Fugo's backstory, life had left these people broken and hopeless, until Bruno brought them under his wing, just as he did for Giorno. These are ostensibly mobsters and criminals, and yet they are portrayed as regular people trying to live their own way, in spite of a deeply uncaring world controlled by powers far greater than any one of them. As Giorno becomes more close with Passion, we grow more comfortable with these characters along with him. Each of the ensuing fights feel all the more dramatic and intense, because of the connection we have forged alongside Giorno. We have grown to love these people alongside the protagonist, and we want to see them win, to see them not let life's hardships defeat them. And what I think is really beautiful is how Giorno's bond with his friends shows in his battles, as he combines his stand abilities with those of his compatriots to trick their enemies and gain the upper hand. Even as the jaws of defeat close in on them, as the villains grow stronger and seek to destroy our heroes, it's heartwarming to see the friendships persevere. You can see this theme of camaraderie and solidarity throughout all the different parts, such as the town of Morio in Part 4 or the prison gang in Part 6. Araki makes his characters feel real through their quirks and motivations, and binds them through their connections to each other. If your friend has a fondness for stories where goofy friends find their way together despite hardship and fights, Jojo's will surely be up their alley. But perhaps your friend likes characters that are a little more sinister. Listen, I get it. I love villains. I always have, ever since I was a small child crying my eyes out because Maleficent died at the end of Sleeping Beauty. I think one of the core appeals of a villain in any piece of media is how they halt the protagonist's progress. Since our hero has a goal, usually one opposed to that of the villain, the two interacting and coming into conflict is inevitable. It is this conflict between our hero and the villain that gives the story stakes, makes the struggle matter. That's not to say that a story can't work without a villain or even a clear antagonist, but this juxtaposition between hero and villain is essential to the identity of combat-based anime like Jojo's. Villains like this can challenge our hero through anything from their physical strength, mind games, subterfuge, even nothing but their own deranged worldview. And these challenges force our hero to confront themselves and grow, to overcome their flaws and triumph. The villain has to have a believable sense of menace and danger in order to make this sense of growth and progression feel earned. And if your friend has a fondness for these kinds of narrative-heavy foes, oh boy, they in for a ride. While JoJo's uses its minor villains fairly well for building effective one-off challenges, the show utterly excels at highlighting the signature villain of each part. Each of them feels distinct from one another, not only matching the tone of their respective story, but challenging the heroes with unique methods. Whether you prefer the bombastic magnificence of Dio or the quiet dread of Kira, you have plenty of options to call your favorite. Something I think the show does very well to make its villains feel more real is to give them quirks and motivations without making them sympathetic. There's a tired cliche where a story presents a villain doing morally reprehensible actions, but yet there is some link that makes it okay. Often this is because of a family member or some other connection that is there to attempt to make the viewer sympathize with the villain. It's more often than not a dead wife or a daughter. Oftentimes this attempt at humanizing the villain falls flat because it comes out very briefly and doesn't add anything to the events of the story. JoJo expertly avoids this problem by showing how its villains' monstrous actions are extensions of their nightmarish perspective. The villains are so convinced of their own superiority and so devoid of empathy that they full-heartedly believe that their actions are completely justified, even if only to themselves. And there's something almost commendable about that portrayal, where you understand how their position and power has led them to what they are now. And while this type of bravado and egotism can sometimes make a villain feel one-dimensional, Araki fleshes out his villains through the same type of quirks that he gives his other characters. Little touches like Enrico Pucci counting prime numbers to calm himself down serve to show that the villains have lives and thoughts outside of the protagonists. They're people with their own goals, even if their goals are insane and morally bankrupt. To show you what I mean, let's look at one of my personal favorites, Cars from Part 2, Battle Tendency. Cars was born as a genius prodigy among the ancient Pillar Men, a tribe of powerful creatures resembling humans but far stronger, smarter, and ageless. Despite all their superhuman abilities, they had one weakness, the light of the sun. Exposure to sunlight was lethal for Cars' tribe, and this to him was unacceptable. His people were demigods, so superior to all other forms of life that they could reign over the world, and yet, one thing kept them away. Using his wits and prowess, he created a stone mask that could enhance his body and push his people's abilities even further. However, as word spread about his experiments, his people turned on him. Terrified of his creation and what he could unleash, the tribe ignored his offer of immortality and attacked him. Defending himself and his ambition to conquer the sun, Cars slaughtered his tribe, leaving only 3 other survivors. Now the mask is too weak to pierce his skin, so he seeks the red stone to complete his goal and ascend to godhood.
Once we have that, we will conquer the sun, and then become the final perfect step in evolution.
From this we know why Cars seeks the stones and how he views his own actions. There's no way we can sympathize with him, but we understand him. His relentless ambition carries over in every other part of his character, from the way he speaks to his ruthless fighting style. But we also get scenes and details that show his refusal to let other life forms be harmed. His desire to become an ultimate life form leads to a respect for other forms of life, with the only exceptions being humans. Cars is a genocidal maniac, and yet his portrayal lends him an infectious charisma, one that makes him incredibly fun to watch, and makes his ultimate defeat all the more satisfying. Cars and his Pillar Men also serve as an excellent example of how Jojo frames its archvillains in the greater context of each part. Whenever our heroes overcome one of the minor foes in 1 or 2 episode fights, the show always reminds the viewer that these fights are stepping stones in the path to defeating the main villain. And this works because without this rising tension, the individual fights would feel detached and unconnected. Even in Stardust Crusaders, which features the most amount of one-off villains, the hunt for information about Dio's stand and the constant barrage of travel problems makes the moment when the gang finally arrives at Dio's mansion feel all the more earned. It adds an unshakable air of mystery and terror as our heroes steel themselves for the final battle. And you can see this kind of story progression in the other parts as well, with the villain's minions acting as little clues that build up intrigue as the heroes uncover the truth. The notable exception to this is Part 4, which directly subverts this type of story progress to create a new kind of encroaching horror, as our protagonists are painfully unaware that their target is hiding in plain sight. Jojo recognizes its villains as vital characters to the story, and uses the same level of depth to flesh them out, creating delightful and maniacal foes that work both as another piece of Jojo's weird and wild world, but also as effective obstacles for our heroes to overcome. Which brings us to the best way I can recommend Jojo's to your friend, and that is, its utterly fantastic battles. Alright, I know why you're really here. You want to hear me tell you how to explain that, yes, the buff ghosts punching each other are actually very cool. Animated fights are awesome, let's get that established firsthand. If your friend isn't into those, then I'm afraid I have thoroughly wasted your time here.
Useless, 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 useless!
Fights in anime boil down to 2 main factors: external and internal narrative. External narrative makes a fight feel much more impactful in the greater sense of the story. This is important because it gives the action context and solidifies the moment as a crucial point in the story for the characters involved. Think about iconic battles like Scar's fight versus Bradley in Fullmetal Alchemist, or Kurapika versus Uvagin in Hunter x Hunter. These fights have amazing animation and action, but the story behind them is what makes them truly fantastic. And while Jojo does have these moments, in particular with its arch-villains, Where I think Jojo's fights really shine is in their internal narrative. Internal narrative posits that a fight is just as much an avenue for storytelling as everything else. This means that fights can have small moments of conflict and resolution, and this pattern forms the backbone of Jojo's showdowns. With each advance our hero makes towards defeating their adversary, the villain acts in response, changing their moves to match the hero. Here's an example. Jotaro has encountered the stand. Oh, right, I probably need to explain what stands are. Right, so to explain, Jojo uses two power systems. Hamon in parts 1 and 2, which is essentially magic sunlight energy, good for dispatching vampires and prehistoric supermodels, and stands from part 3 onwards. The reason I haven't explained stands yet is because everything I just described applies to both Hamon battles and stand fights. But while Hamon has interesting fight progression and mechanics, it's stands that really give JoJo's a wild edge and lead to some of the most strange and brilliant fights in any anime. To briefly summarize and oversimplify, a stand is a manifestation of a person's soul, and it can take any shape and have any kind of ability. This gives Araki essentially ultimate freedom when creating enemies for his heroes to face. While early stands have fairly simple abilities, the powers become increasingly specific and narrow. This works not only because of the show's trademark weirdness, but also because it forces our protagonists to adapt quickly to find a counter to the hyper-specific strategy their opponent is using. Right, so with that context, our protagonist Jotaro faces the stand Yellow Temperance and its user, Rubber Soul. Yes, those are the real names, we're moving on. Having tricked Jotaro into punching him, Rubber Soul has latched his adhesive stand onto Jotaro's hand. Jotaro tries to attack in response, but the stand defends its user and begins to slowly dissolve Jotaro's finger. Now Jotaro is on the defensive, since he is unable to do the whole... This results in a series of attempts to escape Yellow Temperance's trap and find a position where he can strike his crucial blow. Fights like this are strategic and tense due to each character's unique abilities and situations. The environment matters as much as the opponent, and awareness of surroundings can be just as much of an advantage as raw power. Araki excels at pushing a character's abilities to their absolute limit, and giving his protagonists narrowing options that bring them closer to defeat, only to have them escape through and find an answer. As the series goes on, the fights escalate into nightmarish puzzles and scenarios, often making the viewer's mind hum trying to figure out how to defeat the user. We see the fights drastically evolve into situations that test our protagonist's quick thinking and capabilities. And what I think best epitomizes the strength of these fights is one moment, what I like to call the moment of pluck. The moment of pluck is a situation where a character is faced with impossible challenges. But rather than sidestep or flee, they barrel straight into their opponents, which not only showcases their sheer determination, but also their quick thinking. I've named it after this moment in part 1. Our hero Jonathan is fighting the fearsome resurrected warrior Bruford. Bruford's attack has knocked Jonathan into a pool of water, and Jonathan is completely out of breath after being hit by such a blow. Jonathan dives further into the water, and unearths a rock just to grab enough air from the bubble underneath and lash out from below, allowing him to strike back and reposition himself. Yes, this is incredibly stupid and very silly, but I love moments like this so much. They remind me of those crazy boss fights where the best way to not get hit is to dodge forward through the enemy attacks to snatch victory from under their nose. It's a moment where the protagonist abandons their fear and pushes through to deliver an incredibly cathartic blow. It sells the sheer danger of the fight and the resourcefulness of the hero. These will often serve as the dramatic finale to a fight, where the tension from how hopelessly the hero is outmatched crumbles away. What's especially interesting, however, is that villains will sometimes have moments like this as well, where it appears the hero has backed their nemesis into a corner, and just when it seems like they've won, the villain finds the smallest of windows to escape or counter back, subverting the viewer's expectations and cranking up the tension to ludicrous heights now that our hero's plan has failed. This back and forth pattern of breakthroughs and narrow escapes creates incredibly engaging fight scenes. While that can sometimes lead to a fair amount of time watching characters explain what exactly is going on, the internal narrative and storytelling are so strong that you'll be eager to see how our hero triumphs. Jojo has incredible fights, grounded by solid, well-rounded characters, memorable villains, all enshrouded with a unique aesthetic and creativity all its own. If any of those things I've just described sound interesting to you or your friend, I cannot recommend this anime enough. With that, there's one question left to answer. Okay, so the easy and lazy answer to this question, if you or your friend think that you might like this show, is to just start at part 1. Makes sense, right? Just start at the beginning. Well, the thing is that doesn't always work for some people. I love this show, but I'll also be the first to tell you that its opening season doesn't really sell the same type of energy and scenarios that would make JoJo's what it is today. I bounced off the first 3 episodes 2 different times before I pushed through, and anecdotally, a lot of people I know stopped after part 1. So what is the solution? A common suggestion is to start at part 3, since that's where stands are introduced and the standard template for the enemy encounters gets established. And I think that's perfectly alright. If you're introducing it to a friend, go with whatever you feel best shows off your favorite moments. Personally, I'll sometimes start my friends on part 2 and explain as they go, generally because I think Joseph is more interesting as a protagonist, the story features more hilarious moments, and the animation and color work greatly improves. If I can only get one episode to show, I start with the best episode of all. I'm talking, of course, about the single best episode that perfectly summarizes the beauty and marvel of JoJo. The one, the only, let's go eat Italian food. See, it's perfect because it combines it. Look, your time is valuable, and if you don't want to sit through 9 episodes of a show to figure out if you like it, that's perfectly understandable. But should you stick to it, you'll find not only a wildly entertaining anime, but one of the most passionate communities I've ever seen. The staggering amount of fan art, discussions, analyses, tributes, animations, satires, music remixes, whatever this thing is. There's a beautiful camaraderie here on display, one that I find incredibly infectious. Multiple times I've struck up conversations with complete strangers just because they're wearing something JoJo related. We'd never see each other again, but we'd both be so happy to gush that it didn't matter. And yeah, is it kinda goofy and silly? Exactly. And perhaps when times are chaotic and bleak, it's okay to be silly. It's okay to revel in something crazy. Something that isn't afraid to be itself, and that invites its audience to laugh along with it. It's fun to be in this bizarre world with a friend. And sometimes, that's all you need. Thank you so much for watching. I know it's been ages since my last video, so thanks for sticking with me. More are on the way. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like or a comment, and subscribe if you want to see me talk about more anime like this in the future. You can also follow me on Twitter, @StarfruitGrady. As always, stay safe, and have a wonderful day.